Captain Jake Morrison stepped out of the transport vessel and felt the artificial gravity of the station settle around him like an old blanket. The neutral peace station hung in the dark space between worlds, orbiting an asteroid that had been carved into a meeting ground for species that could barely stand to look at each other. He had been briefed on the way here about the Valorians and what they represented to the galaxy. They were ancient, they were powerful, and they had little patience for young species like humans, who dared to claim a seat at the table of galactic powers. The diplomatic halls were more grand than Jake had expected. The stone walls shimmered with some kind of embedded technology that made them reflect light in unusual ways. And guards from a dozen different species lined the corridors, each one trying not to acknowledge the others. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. And Jake had been a diplomat for 15 years. Long enough to know when standing in a room felt like standing on the edge of something unknown. Commander Lisa Price walked beside him, her tactical uniform crisp and military sharp. She had warned him before they boarded that the Valorians were unpredictable, and that he should keep his distance from anything that seemed unusual. But Jake respected Price more than anyone else in the Alliance. She had fought in the border conflicts against the Valdic swarms, and she carried that experience with her in everything she did. Now she moved through the diplomatic halls with the same careful awareness she would use in a combat zone, her eyes tracking every movement, every gesture, every hint of emotion that any being in these hallways might accidentally reveal. The great chamber where the formal greeting would take place was unlike anything Jake had seen before. The ceiling soared up at least 50 meters high, and the floor was made of what looked like polished crystal that reflected the light, coming from the overhead fixtures in ways that made it hard to focus, hard to look directly at anything. The Terran delegation took their position on the left side of the chamber, facing the empty space where the Valorians would make their entrance. Jake straightened his dress uniform and tried to project the confidence that the Alliance needed from him right now. They had traveled too far and invested too much for this negotiation to fail. And everyone knew it. The Valorian delegation entered from the far doors, and the room seemed to dim slightly as they moved into the space. Their forms were angular and precise, their bodies covered in what appeared to be a natural crystalline exoskeleton that caught light and threw it back in rainbow patterns all across the chamber walls. They moved with a kind of coordinated grace that spoke to centuries of rigid discipline and perfectly understood protocol. And at the center of the group came Queen Lysera, and Jake found himself holding his breath. She was taller than the other Valorians by at least a head, and her crystalline surface was shot through with veins of deep purple and gold that seemed to glow from within. Her eyes were large and dark, and they moved across the humans with an expression of calm superiority. Jake had studied thousands of historical records of encounters with the Valorians, but no image had captured what he was seeing now. She carried herself like someone who had never once questioned her right to lead, who had never wondered if she was capable of holding power. The weight of her authority seemed to press down on everyone in the chamber, making the air itself feel heavier. The formal greeting ritual began exactly as it had been planned. The Terran ambassador spoke the traditional words of respect and peaceful intent, his voice steady and measured. The Valorian ambassador responded with the cadence of a species that had been doing this for longer than humans had even had written language. And Queen Lysera stood at the back of her delegation, watching and observing everything. Jake found himself watching her too, studying the way she moved, the way her eyes tracked the movements of everyone in the room with such careful precision. And then he saw it. A small tremor in her left side, barely noticeable. A slight wavering in her posture that lasted only a fraction of a second. Her guards did not react. Her expression did not change. But Jake saw it because he was looking for it in the way that years of diplomatic training had taught him to look. Human weakness was being hidden here, being carefully concealed beneath layers of protocol and authority. And he had caught a glimpse of something real beneath the performance. The ceremony continued for another 5 minutes. And Jake watched that tremor happen 3 more times. Each time it lasted just a heartbeat longer than before. And each time the queen's hand gripped the edges of her robes a little tighter. Something was wrong with her. Something that was causing her actual physical pain. And she was working hard to make sure no one noticed. Except Jake had noticed, and he found himself wondering what it meant and why someone as powerful as a Valorian queen would try so hard to hide suffering. The formal greeting was ending. The moment was approaching where both delegations would bow and retreat to begin the actual negotiations in smaller groups. Something made Jake act then. Something that went against every protocol he had ever been trained to follow. He saw the queen stumble just slightly, and without thinking he moved forward. He crossed the space between the delegations in 3 quick strides and caught her arm. His human skin touching her crystalline surface. For one impossible moment, the entire chamber froze. Everything stopped. The Valorian guards moved toward him, their intentions clear and murderous, but the queen raised her hand, and her voice cut through the air like something sharp and bright. "I will see this human alone," she said. And her guards stopped in their tracks, confused and uncertain, not sure how to process an order that made no sense and violated every principle of their military training. Jake found himself staring into her large dark eyes and seeing something there that he could not quite name. She leaned closer to him and whispered words that would change everything for him. For her, and for the entire galaxy. "Since you touched me, you are bound to me tonight," she said. And her voice carried the weight of something ancient. Something that transcended simple biology and simple understanding. Then she turned and walked from the chamber, her guards following behind her in confused silence, leaving Jake standing alone. Jake stood in the center of the chamber, his hands still tingling from the contact, with absolutely no understanding of what had just happened or what those words meant. Commander Price appeared at his side moments later, her face pale with anger and confusion. "Jake, what the hell was this?" she said. But Jake could only shake his head because there was no answer he could give her that would make sense of what had just taken place. The rules of the galaxy had shifted, and Jake Morrison had no idea how to navigate the new terrain ahead. Jake Morrison was summoned to the Queen's private quarters 3 hours after the ceremony ended. And no one could explain why. Commander Price tried to stop him, tried to insist that it was too dangerous. That protocol demanded that no human delegate should ever meet with a Valorian leader alone. But Jake knew that refusing the Queen was not an option. Not after what had happened in the chamber. Not after those strange words that still echoed in his mind. He walked through the station quarters with a Valorian escort. 2 guards who said nothing and offered no explanation for where they were going or what would happen when they arrived. The Queen's quarters were not what Jake expected. They were less of a royal chamber and more of a medical facility disguised as a living space. Large windows showed the starfield beyond the station, and the walls were lined with equipment that hummed with a low vibration that Jake could feel in his bones. Queen Lysaris stood by the window, and she looked smaller somehow, more fragile than she had in the grand chamber. Her crystalline surface seemed to glow less brightly, and when she turned to face him, Jake could see the exhaustion written across her features. "Send them away," she told the guards, and they obeyed without question. Jake found himself alone with the most powerful leader in the galaxy, a being who controlled the fate of billions, and she looked like she could barely stand. "You touched me," she said without preamble, her voice different now, softer, lacking the commanding edge it had carried in the ceremony. "Do you understand what that means?" "No," Jake said, and he decided that honesty was the only tool he had in this moment. "I have no idea what it means." The Queen moved to a chair and sat with visible relief, as if standing had been an effort that cost her everything. "Come sit," she said, and Jake obeyed. For a moment she said nothing, just stared out at the stars beyond the window, and Jake watched her, trying to read her, trying to understand what was happening. "My people are dying, Captain Morrison," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of them, every single one of us. We are slowly dying, and there is nothing we can do to stop it." Jake was confused. He wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her tone made him wait, made him listen. She continued, her story spilling out like she had been waiting for years to tell someone, to explain the truth to someone who might understand. 3 generations ago, a plague began to spread through the Valorian population. It was not like any disease your people have ever encountered. It attacks our genetic code. It unravels the very structure of what makes us Valorian. Our scientists have tried everything. Every treatment, every therapy, every drug that advanced science can create. But nothing works. We have hidden this truth from the entire galaxy, because if the other species knew that the Valorians were weak, that our power was an illusion built on failing bodies, everything would collapse. Jake tried to process what she was saying, tried to imagine a civilization as advanced and powerful as the Valorians facing something like that. It seemed impossible. And yet here was the proof standing in front of him. A queen who looked exhausted beyond measure. "When you touched me," she continued, "something changed. The pain that I feel every moment of every day, the constant ache that never stops. It eased. For the first time in months, I could think clearly. I could move without suffering. Your touch did that. Your human biology did something to me that no Valorian medicine could accomplish." Jake looked down at his hands, trying to understand how something as simple as touch could have such an effect. "This is where you tell me something that sounds impossible," he said. And the queen smiled, just slightly, just enough to show that she appreciated his understanding. "Your blood carries compounds that our science has only begun to catalog," she said. "They come from a world that is far harsher than most of the worlds where other species evolved. Your people survived death world conditions, and your physiology adapted to threats that would have destroyed any other species. Those adaptations, those changes in your genetic code, they can ease the suffering of my people. At least temporarily, Jake repeated. And the queen nodded. "It is not a cure," she said. "Not yet anyway, but it buys time. It gives us the possibility of finding a cure if we work together. If we can maintain the contact between our peoples and our biologies. But there is more that you must understand." She reached out and placed her hand over his. And Jake felt something strange happen, a tingling sensation that started where their skin touched and spread through his entire body. Not painful, but not entirely comfortable either. In that moment, something opened between them. A connection that went beyond simple physical contact. Jake found himself feeling things that were not his emotions, sensing thoughts that were not his thoughts. He could feel her exhaustion, her fear, her desperate hope. And something else, something like trust. Raw and vulnerable, and unlike anything a Valorian leader should ever show to anyone, let alone to a human. When she pulled her hand away, the connection faded. But it did not disappear entirely. Jake could still feel a faint thread of it, like an echo of something profound. "That is the bonding that happens when our kinds touch," she said. "And it is the first time in my entire reign that I've allowed anyone to see me as I truly am. You can sense my honesty now. You understand that what I am telling you is the truth. Not a strategy, not a manipulation, but simple survival. My people are dying. And you might be the key to saving us, but only if you are willing to risk everything." Jake felt the weight of what she was asking, the magnitude of the choice she was presenting to him. If he helped her, he would be betraying the alliance. He would be keeping secrets from his government. He would be working against the organizations that had trained him and trusted him. But if he refused, an entire civilization would slowly fade away. Billions of people would suffer and die. and he would know that he could have done something to stop it. "I need to talk to my commanding officer," he said slowly. And the Queen looked at him with something like alarm. "It is too dangerous," she said. "If the Valorian military discovers what I have told you, if they learn that I am weak, that I need help from humans, everything will change. There are those in my government who would use this against me, who would see an opportunity to take power. Then we need someone we can trust," said Jake. "Someone who understands the stakes. Someone who can help us figure this out. Commander Price is that person. She will understand. And she will help us keep this secret until we know what we are doing." The Queen studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception, searching for some hint that he was lying or playing a game. Finally, she nodded. A slow acceptance of something she did not want to accept, but felt she had no choice but to accept. "Then it must be done," she said, and Jake felt the weight of history shifting on his shoulders. The rules of the galaxy were changing in this moment, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. The alien queen had whispered words that bound him to her fate, and now he had to find a way to save her people from the inside of their own civilization. Knowing that discovery would mean war, would mean the end of everything he had worked for, and would mean that humanity's future hung in the balance. Commander Lisa Price listened to everything that Jake told her, and her face grew darker with each word that he spoke. They sat in his private quarters with the communication systems disabled, making sure that no one could intercept or monitor what was happening between them. When Jake finished explaining about the plague, about the Queen's weakness, about the bonding and the genetic connection, Price stood up and began to pace, her mind clearly working through the implications of what she had just learned. "This is a nightmare," she said finally, running her hand through her hair. "Do you understand what you are asking me to do? You are asking me to hide information from the Alliance command structure, to work against the interests of the Terran government, to become complicit in espionage on a scale that could start a war." "I know," Jake said. "I know exactly what I am asking. And I would not ask if I did not believe it was necessary. An entire civilization is dying. Lisa, billions of people, and we might be able to help them." Price stopped pacing and looked at him, and Jake could see the war happening inside her. The conflict between her duty as a military officer and her humanity. She had always been someone who cared about the bigger picture, someone who understood that sometimes the rules had to bend to allow for survival. And finally, she nodded, just once. Just a small gesture that meant she understood, and she would help. "We need more people," Price said. "We need scientists. We need people who can work on this problem without drawing attention to themselves. I have connections in the research division, people I have known for years, people who would take a risk if they understood the stakes. But it has to be done carefully, quietly. We cannot afford mistakes over the next 3 days." They began to assemble a team, bringing in specialists in genetics, in biomedics and Valorian physiology, one at a time, telling each of them just enough to understand what needed to be done, but not so much that they could compromise the entire operation. If they were discovered, the work began in a hidden laboratory on the station, a place that had been sealed off and forgotten years ago, a place where they could work without being seen or monitored. Jake met with the Queen every night, and each time they touched, the connection between them grew stronger, more defined. He could sense her fears more clearly, could understand the weight she carried as a leader trying to hold her civilization together while being torn apart from the inside by a disease that was eating away at her strength. She could sense his determination, his willingness to risk everything for something he believed in. And there was a connection forming between them that went beyond biology, beyond duty, beyond anything that either of them had planned. The data that the team began to gather was remarkable. Humans did indeed carry compounds in their blood that could ease the suffering of Valorians. And more importantly, There were patterns in human genetics that suggested a resistance to diseases that plagued other species. If the team could understand those patterns, they might be able to engineer a cure that could work for the Valorians without requiring constant human contact. But then something changed. On the 8th day of their work, alarms began to sound throughout the station. Valorian security forces had discovered the hidden laboratory, and Admiral Kessler, one of the Queen's closest military advisors, arrived at the station with a force of warships that dwarfed anything the Terran Alliance had brought with them. Kessler had been watching the Queen for months, had suspected that something was wrong, and when he saw her meeting privately with a human, he had followed her movements and discovered the secret. The Queen was arrested in her own quarters, and Jake and his team were detained for interrogation. But Kessler was careful. He knew that openly executing the Queen would cause problems with the other Valorian factions. So instead, he declared it a security emergency, claiming that the human had poisoned the Queen somehow, creating an unnatural dependency that was making her unfit to rule. The solution, Kessler announced, was to remove the Queen from power temporarily, to restore her health by isolating her from human contact, and to eliminate the humans who had caused this problem. Price and Jake were moved to a holding cell, separate from the rest of the team, and they had only moments to communicate before they were locked away. But in those moments, Price leaned close to him and whispered, "I have been in worse situations than this, Jake. We are going to survive this. We are going to find a way out. Trust me." And then they were separated, locked in isolation, with no way to communicate with each other, with no way to help the Queen, with no way to stop Kessler from taking control of the entire situation. But Jake knew something that Kessler did not know. The Queen could still feel the bonding between them. She could sense his desperation, his determination. And if she could hold on for just a little longer, if she could find a way to resist Kessler's authority, then there might be a way forward. The Valorian political structure was not a simple military hierarchy like the Terran Alliance. There were factions, there were competing interests. There were those who had grown tired of the Queen's leadership, but would not accept it being taken by force. If the Queen could reach those factions, if she could explain the truth about her condition and about her reasons for working with the humans, there might be a chance to turn the tide against Kessler. And Jake, locked in his cell, could do nothing but wait. Could do nothing but hope that she would find the strength to fight back against the conspiracy that was trying to destroy her. The holding cell was made of pure Valorian crystal, and Jake could see out through the translucent walls into the corridor beyond. But no one could see in clearly. He had been alone for 36 hours when the wall suddenly became transparent, and a guard appeared, motioning him to follow. Jake was taken to a transport shuttle, and to his shock, he found Queen Lysera already inside, her guards standing at attention, her authority somehow reasserted despite everything that had happened. "How did you?" Jake began to ask. But the Queen cut him off. The bonding, she said simply, "I felt your desperation. I felt your determination, and I realized that hiding, that accepting Kessler's version of events, was accepting death for my entire civilization. I went to the council. I told them the truth, all of it. And those who feared Kessler more than they feared scandal chose to support me. He has been arrested for treason, pending trial. And now we must leave this station before his allies can organize a response." The shuttle lifted off from the docking bay, and Jake watched as they accelerated away from the station, the Valorian warships remaining in their positions, none of them moving to follow. "Where are we going?" Jake asked. And the Queen looked at him with an expression of grim determination to the answer. She said, "To the archives on Valorian Prime, where the truth about the plague has been hidden for 300 years. If we can access those records, if we can understand how the plague began and who created it, then we might be able to engineer a true cure, not just something that eases the suffering. The journey to Valorian Prime took 4 days. And during that time, the Queen explained the politics of her civilization to Jake, helped him understand the delicate balance of power that kept the Valorian collective together. The ancient bloodlines held power through tradition, through the illusion of strength and perfection, and any sign of weakness threatened the entire structure. But there were those younger Valorians who had grown tired of the old ways, who saw that hiding problems only made them worse. The Queen was betting everything on whether she could convince them that revealing the truth was better than maintaining the live Valorian prime hung in space like a jewel, its surface covered in crystalline cities that reflected light in patterns so beautiful that Jake found himself taking his breath away. But as they descended toward the surface, the Queen showed him another side of the planet. Vast regions where entire cities had been sealed off, where the dead had been buried in secret, where the plague had claimed millions and millions of lives. "This is what I hid from the galaxy," she said. "This is the weight that I have carried alone, knowing that my people were dying and feeling powerless to stop it." The archive chamber was deep beneath the surface of the planet, protected by layers of ancient technology that took hours to unlock. When they finally entered, Jake found himself surrounded by data crystals that contained the entire history of the Valorian people. Centuries of knowledge and experience stored in forms that human technology could barely interface with. But the Queen had brought with her the best minds from the scientific team that had been reassembled after Kessler's arrest, and they began to work, searching through the archives for the origin point of the plague. What they found shocked them all. The plague was not a natural occurrence. It was engineered, designed as a weapon in a conflict that had happened 300 years ago. The Valorians had created it themselves, had used it against a rival species in a war that they had ultimately won. But the weapon had spread back to their own population, had infected their own bloodlines, and had slowly been killing them ever since. "This is our punishment," the Queen whispered when she understood the truth. "This is what we have earned through our arrogance, through our willingness to create weapons of such horror that they destroyed everything, including ourselves." But Jake saw something different. He saw an opportunity, a chance to engineer a cure by reversing the genetic structures that the ancient Valorians had put in place. It was theoretically possible. It would take months of work, and they would need to test it carefully. But it could be done. "There is something else that we must do," Jake said to the Queen, and he explained his plan to her. They would broadcast the entire truth to the galaxy. They would tell everyone about the plague, about the cover-up, about the engineered origin of the disease. The Queen's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of revealing such weakness was anathema to everything she had been taught to believe about strength and leadership. But Jake argued that hiding the truth was what had led to this moment, that asking for help was not weakness, that humans had learned long ago that the only way to survive the impossible was to admit that you could not do it alone. "How could you possibly understand this?" the Queen asked him. "Your people have never had to hide something like this." Jake thought about the wars that humans had fought against each other, the terrible weapons they had created, the mistakes they had made, and he realized that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their physical resilience. It was their ability to learn from failure, to admit when they were wrong, and to move forward with hope that the future could be better than the past. "I understand because I am human," Jake said simply, "because we are a species that survives by not giving up, by asking for help when we need it, by accepting that weakness is just an invitation to grow stronger. Let me help you show the galaxy what you have learned." The Queen stood in silence for a long moment, and then she took his hand, and the bonding between them flared stronger than it had ever been, and she made her choice. 6 months later, Jake Morrison walked through the streets of a Valorian city, and he saw transformation happening all around him. The rigid, Geometric architecture was being softened by new designs that borrowed inspiration from human cities. More organic, more adaptable, the Valorians themselves seemed different. They moved with less precision and more individuality. They talked and laughed and argued without the strict protocol that had governed every interaction before. The cure had been broadcast to the entire galaxy, and the response had been overwhelming, not conquest. Not the power grab that the Queen had feared, but help. Scientists from a dozen different species had volunteered to work on the cure, had brought their knowledge and their expertise to bear on the problem. The Valorians had opened their archives, had shared their genetic secrets, had admitted their weakness, and in doing so, they had become something more than they had been before. The cure was not perfect. It would take years to fully reverse the damage that the plague had done. But it was working. Valorians who had been on the edge of death were recovering. Color returning to their crystalline surfaces, strength returning to their movements. And the experience had changed something fundamental in how the Valorian civilization understood itself and its place in the galaxy. Queen Lysera had made a shocking announcement 3 months ago. She had declared that the days of absolute Valorian rule were over, that her civilization would enter into a true partnership with the other species of the galaxy, that the role of the Valorian collective would be to cooperate rather than to command. Some of her own people had tried to remove her from power, seeing her actions as a betrayal of everything that made them who they were. But a surprising coalition of younger Valorians had stood with her, and she had consolidated her authority, not through force, but through the simple act of being honest about what she needed and what her people needed. Jake had been offered many positions over those months. Humanity had elevated his status to ambassador, a role that recognized his contribution to the peace and the cooperation that was now flowing throughout the galaxy. Commander Price had been promoted to general, given command of a new joint military force that was being assembled to protect the galaxy's interests rather than to advance the interests of any single species. The scientist that they had worked with had become the director of the first interspecies research facility, a place where the best minds from 100 different worlds could work together on problems that affected all of them. But Jake found himself less interested in titles and more interested in understanding the woman who had trusted him with something as precious as her civilization's survival. He and the Queen had spent countless hours together over those 6 months, sometimes talking about politics and strategy, sometimes simply walking through gardens that had been created in old ruins. And always there was the bonding between them, a constant awareness of each other's emotions, each other's thoughts. A connection that had started with a moment of accidental touch and had grown into something neither of them had expected on this particular evening. Jake stood on a high overlook, looking out over a Valorian city that was transforming itself before his eyes. And he felt the Queen approaching before he saw her. She moved to stand beside him, her crystalline surface reflecting the light of the setting sun, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said finally, and her voice was quieter than Jake had ever heard it before. "Thank you for believing in me when I did not believe in myself. Thank you for showing me that strength comes not from hiding weakness, but from facing it. I just touched your arm." Jake said, "I did not do anything special. You showed me who humans are." The Queen replied, "You showed me a species that survives not through dominance or through perfection, but through honesty, through cooperation, through the willingness to ask for help and to give help to others. Your people are remarkable. Jake Morrison, and I am honored to know you." Jake turned to look at her, and for the first time, he could see past the formal authority, past the crystalline exterior to the being inside. A being who carried the weight of billions of lives and who had chosen to carry it differently now. Chosen to share the burden with others rather than bearing it alone. "I think I am falling in love with you," he said, and he did not know where the words came from. They just seemed to emerge from the bonding between them, from the months of working together, from the shared danger and shared purpose. The queen's crystalline surface flushed with color, deep purples and golds spreading through her form. And she reached out and took his hand. That is not possible according to all logic and reason. She said, humans and Valorians are too different. Our biologies are incompatible. Our cultures are too far apart. But perhaps, she continued, perhaps that is exactly why it is possible. Perhaps difference is not something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. They stood together on the overlook, watching as the sun set over the Valorian city, watching as lights began to flicker on throughout the metropolis. Lights that were products of both Valorian and human technology, created together, working together. A symbol of the new alliance that had been forged in moments of crisis and maintained through moments of choice in the distance. Construction crews worked on the first joint human-Valorian research facility, a monument to what could be accomplished when species chose to work together instead of competing for power. And Jake realized that this was what it meant to be bound to someone, not through ancient magic or biological dependency, but through shared courage and facing an uncertain future together, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as partners, as equals, as beings who had learned that true strength came from honesty, from vulnerability, from the willingness to ask for help and to give it when it was needed. The queen looked back at Jake, remembering the whispered words from months ago, words that had started all of this. And she understood that they had different meaning now. She was bound to him not by fate or magic, but by choice, by the choice to trust, by the choice to believe in a future that was different from the past, by the choice to let someone see her weakness and to help her transform that weakness into something new, something stronger, something that could change the galaxy itself.